There are three people involved in the lawsuit: Hughes Sr., his son Mr. Hughes Jr., and Mr. Page. Mr. Hughes Sr., in order to cope with the workload of his business, began a business relationship with Mr. Page. The relationship, according to Hughes Sr., was a 50-50 partnership in which they shared expenses and profits. The plaintiff, Hughes Jr., began working for his father's company after it had become incorporated. Hughes Sr., a few years later, transferred his shares and ownership to his son through a verbal statement saying, "This is yours." There is doubt that Mr. Hughes Sr. handed full control over to the plaintiff due to correspondence between the company and Mr. Page regarding reconciliation of accounts. There was no evidence of the shareholdings in the company, including Mr. Hughes Jr., therefore there wasn't anything that would link them. Due to the lack of evidence of Mr. Hughes Jr.'s shareholdings in the company, Mr. Page was free to do his will. He decided to declare himself as the sole owner of the company without Mr. Hughes Jr. knowing. Through a letter, Mr. Page told Mr. Hughes his employment would be terminated if he did not generate a certain level of business. Later on, he tried to terminate the employment, to which Mr. Hughes responded by presenting a letter in an attempt to wind up their partnership.
There are two main issues in this case. The first one is that it's not clear what kind of relationship there is between Mr. Hughes Sr. and Mr. Page. According to Mr. Hughes Sr. and the plaintiff, it was a partnership, but Mr. Page did not agree. In looking at the evidence, it looks more like it was an individual participation in a common endeavor. Because of this, it is also unclear what the relationship between the plaintiff and Mr. Page is. According to the evidence, the plaintiff was never even a shareholder or director, even though he was given total control of his father's part of the company. The second issue is that there's a lot of important information and evidence that isn't provided by the parties, like written contracts and financial statements. This is an issue because there is not enough physical evidence to fully confirm either of the parties' claims. Therefore, they have to use the limited evidence they have and rely on previous similar cases to make a decision.
The judge decided there was no partnership between Mr. Hughes Sr. and Mr. Page. First of all, there was no written agreement to support the existence of a partnership. The decision was based on the fact that net income and expenses were shared and paid separately, but profit was not. Another reason is lack of accounting evidence. There was no common books of accounts kept. In addition, instead of a partnership, there was more evidence of individual participation, such as holding of separate licenses. It was also decided that Mr. Hughes Jr. was not the owner of the company. His relationship with Mr. Page was merely as a salaried employee, due to the fact that at no time had Mr. Hughes Jr. filed a tax return on behalf of the company. Also, it was an interest in business that had been transferred from Mr. Hughes Sr. to Mr. Hughes Jr., not a partnership interest, so there was no partnership between him and Mr. Page. What this decision says about the Partnership Act is that it does not provide a clear definition of partnership that can be applied to every case. In this case, the judge did have to refer to a previous case to determine how to evaluate Mr. Hughes and Mr. Page's relationship. What this means to how the laws applied out of this case is that one must evaluate if they follow all the necessary obligations to make sure their partnership is actually valid. In terms of application in any similar cases, the judge will follow the same protocol in evaluating each aspect individually, like how their profits were shared, how expenses were paid, and the accounting in the company. If at the evaluation these aspects are not all in common, then they are not under a partnership. To avoid this problem in similar cases in the future, we recommend hiring a legal representative on your behalf and forming well-written contracts with duties and profit sharing written out.
Created using Powtoon.